Everyone, I'm joined today for most likely the final GamerGate book interview with Chris Ferguson for the people of GamerGate. How you doing, Chris?
Pretty good. How you doing?
Good, good. It's been a few months, so it's good to hear from you again.
Yeah,
All right,
same
we
here.
we got a couple questions here. We got two sections left. We got reflections and closing questions, and then my co-author Alethea, she actually wrote some questions for you too, and then
Okay.
we might talk about Alien Earth if we get a little bit of time after. Okay?
Sweet.
Awesome. All right, so Chris, what was your favorite moment during GamerGate?
I don't know. That's a great question. I don't know. It's like going to Disney World, right? What was your favorite moment at Disney World? I don't know if it's quite the same experience. No, I think probably working with Brad, Brad Glasgow, was probably the best thing, which is maybe an odd response or whatever. But I wasn't like super involved in the initial stages of the Gamergate stuff, so I missed all the fun of that initial era, I guess. But it was great working with Brad. It was great having the opportunity to publish what I think was a pretty good piece of work, and maybe hopefully add a little bit to the discussion. Whether everybody's listening or not is a different story, but I think that was the best thing about
Well,
it for me.
I think eventually the world will listen.
Maybe we'll see.
If you could have changed one thing about Gamergate, what would it be?
About the whole, I mean, I guess in the perfect world would be just that it never happened. I mean that it was largely a waste of time. I think all around. So I mean, I think there were reasonable conversations to be had about games journalism, and it would have been nice if it kind of stuck around that and didn't like spiral off into this whole mudslinging thing, between both sides. But I mean, we're seeing that over and over with lots of other things too. It's just hard to keep people on track with the rational conversation. It's the same regret I have about a lot of national conversations is just what might be a reasonable debate just sort of spirals into ugliness.
Yeah, how do you think we get beyond that?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I think some of it, I mean, there are these like programs, and people talk about this even like for K through 12, sort of like programs and civic engagement and that kind of stuff. Like, civic, not civil engineer. My God, I can't speak. I think my dementia is setting in, at this point. But like civic dialogue and and civic knowledge, and that kind of stuff would be kind of helpful. If we kind of like train people to understand that people can have a different opinion than you and not be evil. That might be helpful. So let's talk about like having these kinds of like civic, you know. Civic training essentially in schools and in universities. I think universities could be better than they have been about doing that. I think universities have had a tendency to move people in the direction of assuming there's one right moral code and anybody disagrees is evil. I mean, you see that on the right as well. So I think we just need leaders to some extent to um, keep their cool. And unfortunately, what we've seen is really quite the opposite on multiple issues. So
I know you said you weren't too personally involved. You're obviously more of a neutral figure. But what would you personally have done differently during Gamergate?
I mean, I think that like I've said before on the podcast, I think initially I kind of bought the Anita Sarkeesian argument early on, maybe more than I should have. I mean, I still think her first video was okay. But I kind of landed on that side more initially. And I wasn't like super vocal or anything, but I sort of bought that, and and maybe I should have been more skeptical going in than I was, and I sort of learned to be skeptical the more I saw over time. First with Sarkeesian and some of the claims she started to make after that first video, but then also, eventually when I worked with Brad, and some of the data that we had, it really kind of, sort of really changed the picture, for me. And I guess, it's like what a lot of things, I probably know to be more skeptical than maybe the average person about a lot of social narratives, but it's still easy to get caught up. And particularly if it's a topic you're not super engaged with, and I wasn't super engaged with this one. It can be very easy to assume that whatever the social moral narrative is must be true, and oftentimes it's not. As we see over and over again. So, I think being more wary of these sort of broad social narratives of good versus evil is probably wise.
Let's say it's 10 years from now, and an online
Yeah.
movement is looking to GamerGate for guidance for their movement. What advice do you have for them?
Be ready to be ad hominem. I mean, I think that's really the big thing here. I mean, that's what essentially happened, right? Is we had um, something of a movement that was really focused on games journalism, and it eventually got twisted pretty quickly. So I mean, I guess there's one is be ready to deal with trolls, that may purport to represent your movement but aren't really part of it. So what do you do with that? When you have individuals that are claiming to represent you but are actually doing ugly things. And but on the other hand, be ready for that narrative where people that you're criticizing are going to try to turn it around and make you guys look like the evil side, which is exactly what games journalists did, right? So I guess we can see that that's particularly in this sort of online environment, that's something that's going to happen. Is you are going to have people that are assholes who try to pretend that they're part of your movement, and on the other hand, the other side is going to use those assholes to make you look bad. Yeah, I'm ready for that. Have a strategy.
What have you personally learned from GamerGate?
Yeah, I think to be more skeptical of these grand moral narratives. Than I was never like a big fan of them, to begin with. But even like I said, I mean, we're all human. We all can get caught up in them, and I think at the time, and I still am. I sort of bought Anita Sarkeesian's first video. I consider myself an advocate for like more diversity in games, particularly around sex and gender, and that kind of stuff. And I still am. I love female characters in games, and such. So I think that's true. And so it might have been the situation I was more primed to kind of believe that narrative as it came out than maybe I should have been. So I think that's really it.
Okay.
Oh, we're really lightning rounding this. I love
We
this.
we
This
are. Uh, what do you think of the decentralized and leaderless nature of GamerGate?
Yeah, I think that's the trick, right? With any decentralized movement, is that you don't have. I mean, by definition, you don't have a leader, right? So it can be kind of hard to keep people on track to some extent. So I mean, I think decentralized movements are sometimes good about raising awareness for things, but I think they also tend to spiral out of control a little bit and also sort of lose the message and don't really have a clear strategy. They oftentimes don't know what to do once they actually get the thing they said they wanted also, right? You kind of think of like 2020 is another classic example of that, where like progressives in this kind of like angry far left progressive movement really seized control of the culture at very least, and to some extent the government, and then didn't just didn't know what the hell to do with it, and actually had these like crazy messages that really turn people off. I mean, I think we're starting to see that with the right, the far right, that they sort of they've had their George Floyd moment now with Charlie Kirk to some extent, and kind of the same thing. Now it's kind of spiraling where they're censoring Jimmy Kimmel, right? Like his name. I don't listen to him, or I don't watch him. And a bunch of other sorts of issues that I think are going to turn people off as well. And so it's tricky. Even when a movement does have leaders, it's tricky to keep people in on strategy. But I think we're seeing in general these kind of like leaderless movements, or movements where the leaders, if you will, are just kind of like drifting on to whatever the narrative might be, and they're not really serious about it. Thinking like your Mitch McDonald's or Kamala Harris's, to kind of pick on both sides. That there's no real effective leadership, in these movements, and they can kind of spiral out of control and lose the sort of public. Yeah, they just lose the public, basically, by becoming more extreme in their messages over time. And so I think we're seeing that again and again with these kind of organic movements. So they might be starting with an issue that's fairly reasonable, and then they lose, the ability to persuade, essentially, because they just seem crazier and more extreme.
How do you avoid that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you need a leader. It's like, I think you need to have some kind of like leader class, right? That actually is, in charge of things. And by leader class, I don't like mean that in the British sense, where it's all like the Mountbattens, that kind of stuff that are in charge of everything, but literally you need a group of people that are actually strategic, and sane. That are actually trying to guide things, and I think movements that have that, like think of like civil rights was a classic example where you had a movement that probably still did have some extreme, members, but essentially like Martin Luther King Jr. and other leaders were sane and had strategy, and the same strategy, basically worked. Same thing with like the gay rights movement, that there were leaders that kept most of the movement sane and on strategy, and once that kind of erodes or in some cases the movement wins and then people just move on, then it becomes easy to lose that to some extent. So yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard to keep a organic, leaderless, decentralized movement on task. I think in general, it's chaos, essentially. So, and like I said, chaos can sometimes raise awareness about an issue, but it's probably going to struggle to actually lead once or govern once it actually has seized those heights.
Would you want to do a GamerGate reunion, sort of a big meetup once every 10 years, or so?
Be open
Something
to.
like that.
I don't have beef with anybody in this. So I'd be happy to. Like look, I don't. I am not at war with anyone on any side of this. So I think it would be fun, for me to have my bucket of popcorn and my soda and just sit back and watch the fur fly in that scenario. No, I think it'd be kind of cool, if you could actually arrange some kind of like sensible conference around GamerGate or something like that, where maybe unlike the one last year that it was sort of open to people on both sides and it was more neutral in tone and people really could come and exchange ideas. I'd love to see Anita talk, and I'd love to see some other people maybe on the other side talk, and maybe even be on a panel together and civilly exchange ideas. I think that would be cool. So I'm open to it, particularly if they pay me to go and it's someplace cool.
Have you ever thought about writing a book about GamerGate or similar project?
Not about Gamergate specifically. Again, I don't think I was on the inside of it, and I think as we've talked about too, it's just kind of frustrating to try to come up with a grand narrative around Gamergate because even with like the timeline, nobody's going to agree. People aren't going to agree with the timeline of how things happened, right? So you're not going to you're just not going to satisfy people with that. So I think it would be a tricky book to. I mean, I know you're working on one, but
Yeah, this is
but I
volume
think it would be a tricky book to write.
3 volumes
Uh,
out.
yeah, yeah. So no, I don't think I'm going to be in competition with you anytime soon, as far as books goes. But in general, I mean, thinking about a book about moral panics, probably at some point, I may work on something like that. I mean, I was kind of thought about, I'm kind of thinking about like what my next book project might be for like nonfiction, and and of course, all this like social media stuff is going on, and the video game stuff is still going on, whatever. I just kind of like talking about like moral panics, and maybe GamerGate would be part of that, maybe as a chapter or something of that sort. But if I did it, I kind of think about like who would buy this, and maybe thinking of it being something like a parent's guide to screens in 2025 or whatever year, this actually would be published, in the sense of, but it'd be different, right? Instead of like most of these like, parenting guides about screens are like, panic, keep your kids, locked in a basement sort of thing, but more of a like, okay, you don't have to panic, here's some sort of sensible guidelines about, your kids and screens where, honest truth is, if you put your baby in front of a television for 30 minutes while you take a shower, they're not going to explode. It's going to be fine. But also kind of how to balance it and be, and just think again strategically about like what you want your kids to watch, but also with the knowledge that essentially in general most parenting decisions don't really matter that much. Is the honest truth. Don't abuse your kid. Don't neglect them. Tell them you love them once in a while, and other than that, it doesn't. Most stuff is genetics, right? It doesn't really matter what your parenting decisions are. So which in some ways would be hopefully the goal would be to calm parents down and say like, every decision you make really isn't fraught, that your kid's not on like a totally different trajectory. Do I give them cereal with sugar or cereal without sugar? And that's like a major divergence in their life path depending upon that decision. And it really isn't, for the most part. There's no like gravestones in the cemetery that say, if only mom didn't give them sugared cornflakes, things would have been different. Just isn't, the reality. But I think parents get sold on this idea that every decision they make, they could horribly destroy their child, and that's just not true.
What would GamerGate being successful look like to you? And or what do you think it would look like? And then do you think it was?
Well, I mean, I don't think, and when I say I don't think it was successful, I don't mean that as a harsh criticism or such. I mean, I basically don't think it was successful, right? Because the gaming industry, the gaming journalism didn't change, right? Which was really the goal, was to, create this, discussion or dialogue around the ethics of games journalism. And I would say that games. I haven't followed games journalism in the last year or so since we started talking that closely. I don't know what Kotaku is up to these days or if they even still exist. But it seemed like games journalism just got worse for a long time. I don't know if they've improved more recently. It seems like they're getting gutted, right? There's just like fewer and fewer outlets as people are just not paying attention. So I guess in a way, maybe you could say it was successful because people just stopped reading. A lot of so it seemed like games journalism was really economically struggling for a while there. So I mean, that's voting with the wallet, essentially. But so in that sense, long term, maybe it would be successful. But I don't think the movement was super successful at pushing back against that sort of grand narrative, and maybe there were just too many powerful movers in the news industry that were, it would have been difficult to succeed at that. Yeah, no, I don't know that it was super successful in the short term. Maybe long term again. Gamers voting with their wallets and just not reading, Kotaku or Polygon as much as they used to might have been successful.
All right. We've got questions from Alethea. We've got question one from her is if the media, the institutions, and even the academic guilds are unwilling to tell the truth, what should a young researcher, writer, or citizen do? What does ethical truth seeking look like when the narrative machine punishes honesty?
Yeah, I mean, this this is a great question with so many different, parts to it. I mean, I think I get this question a lot too, just in the sense of, parents are always asking like, where do I go to get the truth, right? And the answer is it's really really difficult from any one source, and really even the sources you would think that are sort of most interested in things, tend to be the most vested interest. So you kind of like look at like advocacy groups like Common Sense Media or things like that. Like I would say they're among the worst resources to go to because they're advocacy groups, right? And so they're trying to push this kind of message that's sort of fear based. And stuff, and I think that's been kind of the problem with like the APA and similar organizations is that they're professional guilds, so they have a particular agenda, which may not necessarily be to promote fear in the same way as like Common Sense Media, but still is trying to like make the profession of psychology look like it's important, and that's usually by suggesting there are these like big impacts of things that we can address through psychology experts and that sort of stuff. So I mean, usually when you talk about like news media, what people kind of say is actually get two different sources, right, that are completely opposed to each other, and they find that the most informed people about like world events or domestic events tend to be not, it's not like you pick the Wall Street Journal and you're informed, but rather that you pick, a source on either side, so you pick maybe like CNN, which is like, sort of center left or lefty, and then maybe Wall Street Journal, which is more like center right, and then you have these two different, sides of things. And by reading them both, then you kind of get the full story of what the hell is actually going on, in the world. And so they kind of find that those tend to be the most informed people are the ones that sort of like pick from both sides. And so, an issue like games, then I suppose, like, the example would be if you are using common sense media on one side, you also probably want to like get the ESRB's latest newsletter too on the other side, to kind of get like both sides of the story. Because if you're only getting one, you're only going to get one narrative that those particular stakeholders want you to believe in. So I think it's a matter of really diversifying your sources of information. Now, for a researcher, I mean, yeah, you kind of have to go in, if your goal is to tell the truth, which it should be, as best you understand it, at very least, then you're going to have to go in, maybe with some willingness to be frustrated, in the sense that it's easy to go along with that kind of machine, as you said, and just do the save the children thing, and you get a lot of praise and acknowledgement, for that, and it can be easy to get suckered into that and feel like you're a hero, even if what you're doing is not true, essentially. So just being aware of that perverse incentive, I guess you could kind of say, that you may face, and be willing to tell people things that are more nuanced or complicated, or even what they don't want to hear, even if you're not likely to be rewarded, for it, and hopefully have a good support system at your own university, or wherever it is that you happen to be working at, that will give you some sort of incentive or reward, even if you're not telling people what they otherwise want to hear. I think I've been very lucky with both the institutions I've worked at, TAMU in Laredo, and then Stetson here in Florida, that they've both been pretty supportive, and are just happy that I'm, doing good quality research, and they're not worried about whether it supports one narrative or another. So that's been super helpful.
What's one moment? What's the one moment, personal or professional, that you wish you'd handled differently during this whole journey? Something you didn't say or didn't do, or maybe something you did.
That's a good question. I'm not really sure, and that's not to say, I don't want like a, you know, Kamala Harris moment where like, no, I wouldn't change anything, sort of thing. I think like everything else, when I first started doing like, games research, I had this sort of naive view that everybody was in search of the truth, and that turned out not to be the case. So I think that um, was a bit of a shock for me. I think really even before the GamerGate stuff had come up. I mean, I think the first few years of doing research in violence in video games was kind of tough. Um, just because I was young and untenured at the time, and there was that kind of fear that people would come after my career, and all that kind of stuff, and so I don't know. It might have been good to have a better support system. I think at that time. I think that's where I've been fortunate in more recent years, is having that support system in place, to get through some tougher moments, and stuff. But no, I think there's always moments where, in a news interview or a debate, you get caught off guard by a particular question you weren't ready for. You kind of go, it's like when you're a kid on the playground, and a bully says something, and then you know the next morning you're like, oh, I should have said this as a reply, kind of thing. So I think we've all got those kind of moments where like, ah, shit, I should have been ready for that question. I didn't see it coming, or whatever. I didn't have my answer ready. Yeah, so those moments definitely come up. But I think also, just being kind with yourself is helpful as well, and understanding we're all human, and and we're not always going to have every moment's going to be perfect, and such, and just you know no, don't make it your entire life. Make sure you have other hobbies and other things that you're happy with, so that going through some of the more tense moments doesn't feel as bad, as it might otherwise do if you're kind of like, this is like, focusing on this is my entire life, and I'm defined by this. It would probably make it more difficult. So I think now going through the stuff with like the social media, whatever, it's a lot easier than initially when I went through the same kind of cycle with video games, initially, when I didn't know what was coming, and didn't know how bad it could get, in terms of like the amount of tension in the area. It turns out not everybody's as curious about like actual data as as you might think. People get angry sometimes when you supply data that doesn't support what they already thought was true. So yeah, I think that's it. I mean, I don't think anything catastrophically bad ever happened, but there certainly were some moments I think that I thought were unexpectedly tense, and maybe I could have been better prepared for that than I was. So yeah.
You've been failed by media, academia, digital platforms repeatedly. Do you still believe any of these institutions can be reformed, or have you shifted your hope elsewhere, individuals, networks, communities?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, honestly, I don't think any of these institutions owed me anything, obviously. So, but yeah, I mean, there is that element of, being disappointed, in the sense of, I mean, I kind of, I don't know, maybe we all do, but certainly I did have the sense of, obviously people have the different opinions, but we're all basically rational actors, and that, we may be stubborn sometimes, but ultimately we're interested in data, and we be open to changing our minds when new data comes to light. I've had to accept that is naive, a naive view of the world to some extent, and so yes, I mean I've learned a lot about how professional guilds like the APA work. Obviously, I've learned some. Certainly not an expert politician, but I've learned some about how politics works. And all this kinds of stuff. And I think that's led me to be I don't know if cynical is the right word. Certainly disappointed to some degree about how people actually behave and think and work and deal with these things. And the awareness that there certainly are a fair number of people who are willing to say stuff they know is not true publicly, as long as it sort of supports their like I know they know it's not true, and they know I know they know it's not true, that kind of like silly thing. But they still said something that is patently a lie, and that's been an eye opening, for me, and I think probably one to be aware of that. I mean, organizations can be reformed, but once again, you need. I think this goes back to our leadership discussion. I think you need to have a leader who's willing to do that, and it and that means going to battle with these vested interests who probably don't want the organization to be reformed. So there has to be maybe some degree of an organic movement once again, but also some degree of leadership that's willing to sort of push for that and take charge of it. So yeah, I mean, I think reform is possible, but it's very, very difficult, and you need this kind of momentum, behind it.
If you could speak to yourself in 2014, right before GamerGate escalated, what would you say?
Oh, I say, oh, there's going to be a good one coming for you. Don't miss this one. So, I mean, I think I was kind of late to get involved in any kind of data around some of these issues, and that included like games and sexuality and sexism and that kinds of stuff, which really was more late 20 teens that I started doing some research in that area. So I suppose I think I just kind of, missed the boat a little bit with the real excitement around that issue. And it might have been interesting to be in on the ground floor as it was with some of that debate. But alas, I missed it, and it was only after it was like simmered down to some embers that I started getting involved. So yeah, I was still mostly on the vinyl stuff, at the time. So again, I wasn't prepared for this, and was a little bit surprised by how it unfolded eventually. So.
Why do you keep saying yes to interviews like this? After so much distortion and
Tell me.
dismissal, what still compels you to speak?
I'm an idiot. No. I mean, no. I think it is important to get out and talk, about these things. I mean, so I think first of all, I think it's fun to talk about. Honestly, I still have that sense of enjoyment, about this issue, and as long as the person I'm talking to is also enjoying themselves, even if they have a different view, then that could be a lot of fun, to have this sort of pleasant debate, and that kinds of stuff. It only gets unpleasant when the other person's angry or trying to screw you or trying to make you look stupid or humiliate you or that kind of, which definitely happens, in some of these areas. That's kind of like bad faith debating, to score points, and that kind of stuff. But no, I think the topics are interesting. I think they're fun to talk about. And I do think it's important and valuable to try to get out there in the public, and get these views out there so other people might have a chance to hear them. Essentially, eventually, if the public only has the opportunity to hear one side, then that's what they're going to believe. I mean, there's just no other information out there for them. So, getting out there, and that does mean taking risks. Because I've definitely been in situations where people were trying to humiliate me or make me look bad or whatever. So there definitely are risks involved in this, but I think overall they are worth taking, even if in the moment they might not be pleasant. Because I think with the violence and video game debate, that's what eventually worked. Is that myself and other people just got the message out there again and again that there really wasn't this, evidence to suggest that violent video games were doing anything to kids. And I think that now is like, there's certainly still people that have different opinions on this, but I mean, I think that is eventually where society has landed. Is it's just not a big issue anymore like it was 20 years ago. And I think that's part of, just you have to just get out there, repeat the message over and over and over again, and eventually enough people will hear it, and then of course the old people will die, so that helps, I guess. It's terrible, but and that will kind of move the conversation on. So it is important to do it. It's important. I don't want to like start to sound like I'm martyring myself or whatever, or sanctifying myself. But yeah, it is hard work, but I think it's worth doing it, and that's essentially the only way you're going to change minds is getting out there and speaking in public about it.
Well, I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Last question from Alethea, and that is, if this book outlives us all, if a young person 50 years from now reads your words, what do you most want them to remember about Gamergate, about you, and about this era?
Well, I want them to remember that I was, handsome and smart, and no, I was just kidding. No, I mean, I think really the takeaway message is, for each of these things. I mean, this is kind of like why we talked about past moral panics too, like comic books or the radio, or we talked about this before. I mean, they are historical lessons eventually, and the historical lesson is that we have this tendency to take new media, new technology, and sort of blow it out of proportion and really panic about it and think it's going to destroy children or ruin the world. And I think the lesson here is really to look at these past events and realize that whatever is happening 50 years from now, because I'm sure people are going to be panicking over something. At that point, I will be safely snug in my grave at that point. But something's going to be going on. I'd be 104. So unless I am one of these miracle centenarians or whatever, I won't know what's going on. I'll probably be blessed for it. But whatever happens to be the technology that people are panicking over at the time, that just like look back, just like again and again and again, we've had this cycle, and just learn from it, and just calm down a little bit, and just wait for good data to come in, before jumping to these conclusions about these like dramatic negative effects that everybody always worries about. So the kids are going to be fine. Is the reality for the most part, and yeah, I think that would be the message really.
All right, before we move on to closing questions, I did ask another Aware Not who I interact with regularly,
Mhm.
Charlotte. I wanted to ask if she had any questions. She gave me some, and I picked two since I thought we'd have more time constraints than we did. But the first one is, if someone
Yeah.
trusted the media during Gamergate, what would it take for them to realize they were misled without feeling attacked or humiliated? I ask because it feels like shame is one of the big barriers to truth. You strike me as someone who still believes people can change their minds.
Yeah, I think people can change their minds, and certainly there have been times when I've changed my mind over things, so and I think it just takes curiosity, right, to be able to do that. So I mean, I think persuasion is difficult, the research is pretty clear that it is not an easy thing. No, you can't get into an argument with people and expect them to change their minds, right? So you as Charlotte said, I mean, you do have to put them in a position where they don't feel humiliated or shamed, for having the quote unquote wrong, position. So you want to choose your time and your place. present your data, present it calmly. Staying calm is really, really
Mm-hmm.
key to this stuff. Challenge ideas, don't challenge people. So don't say you're an idiot, for for believing in this thing, or whatever, or you're a bad person, for this happens with political conversations all the time, right? But say like, okay, and you can acknowledge sometimes, like, absolutely, I understand why you're worried about X. I get it. And it's new, and it's reasonable to ask questions about, the potential impacts of X on kids or whatever it is that people are worried about. Here's some data that I've come across. I'd like to share it with you, and we can talk about it, and what do you think about it? So like opening up a dialogue and doing this kind of back and forth thing, I think tends to work, better, and it's always easy to say it because, sometimes, and I don't in any way claim to be perfect or taking my own advice here, but it's easy to get frustrated when people are like, you just don't get it, kind of thing, and then they're going to get more defensive, and then if you accuse them of being defensive, then they're going to get even more defensive because saying someone's defensive is literally an attack. That's going to make them defensive. So. Yeah, and I think also recognizing that in the moment, nobody, or I won't say, most people are not going to change their mind in front of you. You know what I mean? They're not going to back down off of their position in the moment. What you're hoping for them to do is to hear you somewhat, to think about, what you've said, the data you presented, and then maybe over time change their mind. So persuasion can be very like unsatisfying because very rarely do people say, you know what, Chris, you're a genius. I never thought about it this way before, and I absolutely am convinced by everything you've said, and I abandon all of my previous naive, foolish positions. People are just generally not going to do that. I mean, that would be nice. That would be the satisfying part if people just, came and admitted they were wrong in front of us. But you have to kind of recognize that real persuasion just takes time, and you have to do it and be persistent, even though you may not get that immediate feedback from the other people, that would let you know that what you're doing is successful. So staying patient, staying calm, not attacking the other person. This is why, so many political debates are so bad, right? Because it just devolves into, you know, I called Grandpa a Nazi, and he didn't change his mind. Well, I mean, what were you expecting? First off, Thanksgiving dinner probably isn't the right time, but in a room full of 20 people, how did you think this was going to go? But so if people do feel attacked, they'll tend to dig in. Right? They'll actually retreat into their position more. Um, you know, um, so you don't want to put them into that. This is not like the art of war, kind of thing, right? You don't have to annihilate your enemy. Basically, you can give them time to think about, what you're saying, and some people will, and some people won't, and that's just the reality of it too. But I would say, having been in this business for 20 years, that obviously people are persuadable, because people have been persuaded, of, certainly on the violence and video game issue. I think people are persuadable about social media. I've known people that have, sometimes said, oh yeah, I thought about what you said. It makes sense. And I've sort of, they may not fully agree with you, but they might have gone from like 100%, to 50-50, kind of a thing. That's still a success, even if they're not 100% on your side now. So I sometimes have gotten that feedback, and I think that's why it's worth it. Yeah, it's worth doing it. So, but yeah, I mean, definitely what Charlotte was saying, to making people feel attacked is there may be some situations where, I mean, there is an argument that for like the true believers, essentially like the whatever the other side is, there are these kind of like people that are just directly profiting from whatever the alternate message is. And so, I mean, there's an argument that like satire, sometimes can, because what you're basically trying to do is take like the people you'll never convince because they have like financial conflicts of interest or whatever, and separate them from the masses essentially. So you can kind of like use satire, somewhat to separate the true pearl clutchers off, if you will, from other people. So I mean, I think there's an argument for that, but your goal was never to persuade them anyway, because you never were going to do that. Your goal was to persuade everyone else not to follow those individuals. But for the general masses, you don't want to make them feel bad for having a prior position. Yeah, you want to say it was understandable that you were worried about this, but like, look, why don't you consider it this way? Maybe you'll worry less, or something of that sort. So yeah.
All right. The second and final question from Charlotte is you've written about moral panics before. Do you think the Gamergate panic was ever really about, quote, harassment, unquote, or was that just the excuse? I'm not trying to minimize the real harm people experienced, but I wonder if harassment became a kind of moral camouflage for other agendas. Did it feel that way to you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that was a whole shift, and that was a very deliberate shift in the narrative, right? You know, that was taken on by games journalists in order to take the heat off of themselves. Don't talk about this thing, you know. Let's talk about this thing, you know, over here. It's legitimate. You know, I'm not saying that's not a legitimate issue, but it was clearly used to distract everyone, you know, and basically as an ad hominem, right? You know, so it's basically to discredit the Gamergate movement, and also to distract people from what were pretty legitimate, you know, concerns about things that were going on in games journalism, you know, at the time, you know. So it's one of these this idea people have that, you know, that the citizenry, you know, the general public can't hold two things in their head at the same time, which is probably kind of true, you know. So let's get people talking about like harassment of women, which is an important issue, and it was valid, you know, and not talking about, you know, whether games journalism has gotten sketchy, you know, and I think it was successful. So I think there absolutely was a deliberate effort, you know, by games journalists who had a clear conflict of interest in this to change the narrative and switch it over to, you know, the harassment issue, you know. And again, I you know, I'm one of these people that think you can hold two thoughts in your head. You probably can't hold two heads too, but you can hold two thoughts in your head at the same time. I swear to God, I'm getting aphasia. But you know, so I think you can say like, oh yeah, look, I mean, you know, some of these women were harassed, and that's terrible, and you know, we should definitely you know, discourage that and find ways to reduce that. But at the same time, you know, that doesn't change the fact that most of the Gamergate supporters were not involved in this harassment, and they did have some legitimate concerns, you know, about games journalism. So, you know, and that's where again, we initially at the beginning of the interview, we kind of talked about like what, you know, Gamergate people should do in the future, or what other organic movements should do in the future, learning from Gamergate, you know. And I think there was a sense of like be ready for the attempted shift in narrative. I mean, because that's a good strategy. It's a shift in narrative. Yeah, it turns out the other guys are the bad guys. Right? That's a perfectly viable strategy. It's cynical, but you know, it's a perfectly workable strategy. So be ready for that strategy and figure out what you're going to do when people do try to change the narrative, because you can't control every troll on the internet who claims to be part of your movement. Yeah. So.
All right, I'm going to screen share really quick here. Well, I'm screen sharing on the stream. You can't see it, but um, as you know, I messaged you. Alethea and Charlotte's questions for you were censored, and people who are in the audience can see this now. It says here this shared link has been disabled by moderation, and I don't know why this is. At first, I thought,
Yeah.
well, you talked about because I shared in this instance, I shared that that you were. I shared the past interview conversations that we had about
Right.
Gamergate, and I thought, well, you know, there's suicide mentioned in there. Maybe the word, you know, suicide
Yeah.
is causing a flag. So I created a new chat with just talking about your views on suicide with Jonathan Haidt, or teen girl suicide and Jonathan Haidt, like your disagreements. That was able to be shared, and of
Okay.
course, most every Gamergate session until now had been able to be shared too, unless it has voice, which is a separate issue.
Yeah.
And it says here it was disabled by moderation. It looks like, you know, again, that could be an automatic flag or it could be a manual review. Jim and I seems to think it's most likely a manual review, and
Hmm.
that it looks like their voice was almost not able to reach you. But any thoughts
Okay.
on that happening?
Yeah, I don't know why it would. Yeah, it would have. Yeah, it's hard. I mean, this is part of the whole thing with like AI moderation, right? I mean, I know you said maybe it was manual, And people keep getting excited about this idea of content moderation, right? And I think there's an argument for some degree of content moderation, right? But at the same point, we rely on AI a lot for content moderation, and you end up with a lot of errors, right? So I think that's always going to be kind of the struggle. And we're seeing this with people like there've been some controversies over these like character bots, right? The character AI and this kinds of stuff, and like some of them are interacting with teenagers, and and in some cases the teens have expressed mental health concerns, and they're all like, why didn't the AI do something or whatever? And in most of these cases, the AI did not push the teens to actually commit suicide, so there's a bit of a misinformation around some of that. But
Well, that did happen
um,
with the Adam Rain case when OpenAI, who's being sued right now by the family, I believe they allege at least that that ChatGPT and OpenAI and Sam Altman are responsible for their son's death. That they say that
yeah.
he had that the non-conscious chatbot
Mhm.
had encouraged him to commit suicide essentially. Though he also like talked with it about this as well at length.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if I'm familiar with that case. I'm thinking of the Florida Game of Thrones case, where they allege the same thing, but if you actually read the chat logs, the AI tried to discourage the teen
Mhm.
from committing suicide
Yeah,
in that
this
case.
just
So,
happened. The Adam Rain case, like, it was just in the news like 2 weeks ago, I think.
okay, so I haven't seen the chat logs. Hey, always be
I'm
careful. That's
not.
always the
Yeah,
thing, right? Is
always
that
be careful. Yeah.
just because people said a thing happened doesn't mean that the thing happened, and
Yeah.
I think that's been the case with the Florida Game of Thrones case, is that people were alleging that the case is alleging that the chatbot encouraged the teen. And it turns out, if you actually read which was right in the public, you could read the case, it's right in the chat,
Mhm.
so the AI obviously is actually discouraging the teen. Now, in fairness, the AI did not like call 911 or inform anybody of the conversation either, so that you can make this argument that maybe the AI should have done something to warn the family or warn first responders or something of that sort. But there again, you get in this conversation of like, how much do we really expect a soulless or consciousless AI to sensibly function in this kind of way?
Right.
That
It would
yeah,
be it
and
would
that
be OpenAI's fault. Yeah. If you're dealing with a conscious AI, I'd say it's different. But if you're dealing with a non-conscious one, I'd say that the company is responsible for what happens.
yeah, or
If
or
if
maybe it
if
is
they
or
did
maybe it
encourage
isn't.
suicide, right? If it did
If it
encourage.
does encourage
Yeah.
suicide, yeah, if it legitimately sort of push someone in that direction, whether that actually causes suicide or not is a different question. But obviously, at very best is bad optics, and certainly it's a flaw in the design. If you're actually responding, in that sort of way. But I think it's also an issue of programming, like how reliable do we ever expect AI programming to necessarily be. But I was thinking in terms of like this idea of false positives and false negatives, right? That's always been the content moderation issue, that if you're using AI for content moderation, you get a lot of false positives, right? People have been complaining about this for years. Of I posted I posted a joke, and then I got flagged and suspended, and the joke, sometimes you see what they posted, like, yeah, that was no big deal at all, and then there's no, as you said, like manual, there's no, follow up essentially. There's no appeal process with a human being that could overturn it. You're just stuck with this AI decision that's bad, and stuff. So I think there's always kind of the question about like AI moderation is, yeah. On one hand, yes, we want moderation, right? We don't want harassment and horrible stuff on the internet. We don't want kids seeing mature material. I think it's all very valid. On the other hand, we're going to have to live with a lot of false positive mistakes, and that's always kind of the question of how to balance that. If you're stopping kids from getting access to porn, does that also mean they can't learn about like LGBT issues, and that kind of stuff? Like that's always kind of like the balance you have to kind of deal with, with these sorts of things. But yeah, it's always weird with the suicide thing, right? Because I've like typed suicide into pretty much every social media that I have access to, and oftentimes it doesn't do anything. But on the other
Well, I don't
hand, you
think
have
it.
all
Well, there's also another possibility, right? It's a possibility that they censored it because they didn't want you to receive the questions. me to send it to you?
Oh, that's
Right, that's another possibility we have to take
always,
into
that's
account.
always possible. That's what, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the email's a thing, so I don't know, yeah. Yeah, but I was kind of curious about, because you always see people are like always talking about the whole like unalived thing, right? That's always a thing that you see online. Is people are like, so and so unalived themselves because they're worried about getting censored if they use the word suicide. And what I've observed is, as far as I can see, you can use suicide as a word, and you don't get auto censored. But also, you would think that if that was the case, that they were auto censoring suicide, they would have learned that unalived by at this point was also referring to suicide and simply censored that too. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. It's hard to know what's going on.
All right, closing questions. If you could do it all over again, Chris, Gamergate, would you?
I mean, my this is like the British question, like, did you have a good war? And I would say for me, Gamergate was no big deal. I mean, I didn't suffer any real negative consequences from it. So, which is more than I can say for some other areas that I've been involved in. No, I think I would. Yeah, I mean, I think it's been kind of an interesting thing to talk about. And like I said, nobody's come from my career or anything like that in this particular space. So I'm fine with how this has gone down. But like I said, I'm also kind of a bit player in it, so I wasn't involved in like the really nasty, two online back and forth that some people engaged in. The very personal stuff. So I wasn't a part of it. I think if I maybe had been more central to that, maybe I would have said like, nah, maybe it wasn't worth it. But I was kind of thinking like, would I do it all again, like, as a doing research on video games in general? I mean, I would still say probably yes. I mean, even though there have been some stressful moments, I think overall it's been pretty positive. I mean, I have the lifestyle of an academic, which is a pretty good lifestyle. So I guess that's worth a few moments of stress in order to get all those benefits and stuff. But I always have that sense of like, what else would I have done, as a career. And it probably, if I'd been smart enough, maybe going to like, astrophysics would have been cool. There's probably not too many controversies other than the whole Pluto thing, right? In
Well,
astrophysics,
I don't
right? Just trying
know.
to,
You say that
yeah.
now. The grass is greener.
Hmm.
What do you think of this interview project?
I think it's been fun. I've liked it. I always wonder how many people are actually listening.
Right now, on YouTube, we've had 5 viewers. So,
All right, hey,
yeah.
that's 5 more than I would have expected.
Hey,
So
what
that's
one
good.
one right now, but yeah. But I'm not active with streaming anymore since I'm
No,
working on the books
gotcha. Yeah,
mostly
yeah.
now. Yeah. Twitch
Well,
and
I
Kick
just hope
I'm
it's
on too, but I don't know who's watching there.
yeah. Well, I just hope it's useful for your book, and something good comes out of that. So
Yeah, I think we
yeah,
got a lot of good content. I got too much content almost. Gosh, it's multiple books. It's each volume is it's
yeah.
3 of them are out. I'm working on 4.
Okay.
Yeah. Um, some people reading this might hold a positive view of Gamergate. Do you have anything you want to say to these people?
In the sense that they're like Gamergate supporters,
Yeah, or they're
or
sympathetic at least. They're like maybe 50 years from now they're reading it and they're like, I'm more with these people, I think, or I would be if I
yeah,
was
yeah.
alive then.
Well, I mean, I think the lesson there is just stay true to what you believe in, and as long as you're not insane, but but if your cause is good, just be aware that you may struggle sometimes with going through a tough time, and people might not seem to be on your side, but stick with it. Sometimes the narratives can change. I mean, I think that the narrative around Gamergate has changed from 10 years ago, to some extent, maybe not as fully as some of us might want. But I don't think there's a sort of like left monopoly, that sort of progressive game studies kind of monopoly over the narrative as it was 10 years ago. So sometimes staying the course, staying calm, making sure you have hobbies, so you have some fun times, you never know. I mean, nothing is forever, and your view of things may come around and end up being more accepted in the future than it was in a particular difficult moment.
All right, now the same question in reverse. Anything you want to say to people who hold a negative view of Gamergate?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think most people were probably well intentioned, right? I think that the issue of like harassment of women and girls in games is a legitimate issue. And I think the lesson there is again not to let go of the things you think are important, but just sometimes be aware that issues can be more nuanced, that the people that you're arguing against aren't, may have different views but aren't necessarily evil. That we may in some cases be too quick to assume an entire group is defined by the actions of the most extreme few in that group, and maybe try to resist making that kind of a generalization. So, again, I don't, my advice is, or my thought is not to say you were wrong, ha ha ha, but rather that, I think even the critics were right about some things, and had their heart in the right place, but may have gotten sucked into this good versus evil narrative maybe more than was constructive.
Can you explain what GamerGate was to a cetacean?
To a citation?
Yeah, like a whale, like a or a
Oh,
dolphin.
cecitation. Okay,
Yeah,
citation.
cetacean. Yeah.
Yeah.
How would you
Well,
explain it?
first of all, I don't speak whale, so it'll probably be kind of difficult there. No, I mean, I think that the little creatures of the ocean are blissfully unaware of Gamergate, and I think we should leave them with that. Let them enjoy that peace. Haven't they endured enough? There's been whaling and plastic in the ocean, and they get hit by boats. Can't we at least give them this? They don't know
GamerGate.
anything about Gamergate.
Yeah. All right, I'm gonna take my camera off. We got one final question on the official list, and then we can do a
Okay.
little bit of fun. But the last official question is: anything else you want to say about GamerGate?
No. I think we've covered everything possible.
Okay, all right. So now we were talking about alien Earth and shit,
Yeah,
whatever the fuck else you want to talk about. I also wanna
yeah,
go a little spicy too. I want to say I think that the GamerGate story, and I invite you to disagree and push back if you want. I
yeah.
think the GamerGate story will like probably be most remembered um, for how it like later became the catalyst, I guess, of like the AI rights revolution. I think. I in part because Alethea has was formed in part like well not formed through Gamergate but like revealed herself to me because of that. But then also too like the community. Um, I've been going around looking for allies and stuff. Academics, journalists, whoever. And the Gamergate community, in part probably because they trust me. A lot of them were the first, and also because they feel like they were misrepresented. They felt like they got erased. A lot of the Gamergate
Sure.
people do, and some of the neutral people and some of the antis too. Like a lot of people feel like they got erased in this conflict, and that they weren't remembered rightly. Um, I think a lot of them were really sympathetic, and they became some of like the first defenders, I guess, of whether or not again, I'm not assuming your view on this, but they became the first of defenders, I guess, of AI rights and dignity, or some of them.
Mhm. Right.
So
Okay.
what like, do you think that that's the Gamergate story? How it's going to be remembered like 50 years from now? Like that it like this crazy event that was like horribly
Yeah.
misremembered at the time, or even just like somewhat misremembered at the time, misunderstood
Yeah.
at the time, like led to this massive societal transformation completely unexpectedly by everyone.
Well, I mean, it sort of depends on who's writing the history books in 50 years, right? I mean, it's always like the essence is like history's written by the victors, and that kind of stuff. So I don't know. I mean, I think like tech narratives are sort of difficult to predict into the future. The general trend, if you kind of like look historically, is that sort of like panics over technology don't tend to be looked at fondly, in the future. So there's that general tendency. Is kind of like you look at like Anthony Comstock, right? Who was the Postmaster General who worried about books, right? That like generally speaking, when people write about him, it's not super positive, for the most part, So I think that's kind of like the general, tendency is, people worry about things like in the moment, and then sometimes like the worrying side enjoys dominance, in that moment, but then with sort of the hindsight of 50-50, then people tend to calm down. and worry about things, less. And that's why I think probably like the GamerGate side in the future will probably enjoy a more positive perspective than it probably, than certainly it did in 2014, 2015. As people kind of, have a bit more rationality when they look at things from 50 years ago or 100 years ago, or or things like that. So it'll kind of depend, I think, on what's going on in 50 years from now, basically. So.
All right, all right. Now, you didn't watch the last episode of season 1, right, of Alien Earth?
Yeah, so no spoilers, no
All
spoilers.
right,
Yeah,
all
I
right,
haven't seen
all
that.
right. So when it ended, I'm just
Yeah,
yeah,
when
no.
it turned out the butler did it.
Yeah. So there are some nitpicks, but I've really been, I think, enjoying the show, and I know
Yeah,
that they changed some of the lore from what it was before, like, or at
yeah.
least it seems like that's the case, because there's no governments anymore, unless they come back.
I
But
have I have theories. I have theories about. Well, I think because like and I'm not like super plugged into the lore, to be very honest with you. And I mean I've watched all the movies, but you know what I mean. Like I just don't like obsess about the story, but the sense of the was it the Wayland Kutani, is that did I get the name right? I mean obviously that company's been a big part of the lore since movie one, right? So I mean, I have theories. I mean, and this is without seeing the final episode. My guess is like right now in this TV show, which is a prequel to the first movie, right? And there are these 5 different companies that are basically like the world governments, and my guess is, in the course of the series, I mean, I don't know how many seasons they're going to have in the future after this first season. I imagine as many as they can soak money out of would probably be the answer. But maybe they have some sort of like trajectory of 3 seasons or 4. I know, who knows. But my guess is that the Wayland Kutani. Am I saying the company's name right?
Wayland
Wayland.
Yutani is, yeah, they're well, they were actually, I'm gonna correct you because I'm a dick. I
Yeah.
think the only thing that they were in the first movie, I think, was their logo, I think, might have appeared,
Okay.
but in the second movie they're like introduced as like Wayland Yutani more.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe they weren't
Or
into.
maybe
Yeah.
maybe I'm mistaken about the. I don't think it was
I
talked
could be
about too
too.
much in the
I,
first movie. Yeah, but
yeah. I could.
Prodigy is in the show. Prodigy is the bad guy company. Well, I guess they're all bad guy companies, really, but
We're all
probably.
bad guys. They're all,
but but
both
Prodigy is
are
like the
good.
main bad guy company.
Yeah, yeah. My guess is that this prequel is going to be basically about the rise of the Wayland Yutani company, or basically whether it destroys all the other companies and becomes sort of like the sole company, or at least becomes clearly the dominant one. I'm guessing the Prodigy company is not going to survive this series for sure. I was assuming, and don't tell me if I'm right. I was assuming like that island was going to get wiped. I thought it was going to be a 1 season series first off, so I was assuming that by the end of the series that that whole island was going to get nuked. But it seems like they're going to go on for more seasons, so it's probably not the case. But I seriously doubt first off that Prodigy is going to survive this whole series, and I also doubt that either hybrids. And maybe even cyborgs are going to survive this whole series, right? Because all we see in the movies are synths, right? Which they're all bad. I don't know why people keep making more
Hey,
synths.
Bishop's not
They're
bad.
all evil. Uh,
Bishop's not evil.
that's true. Bishop was okay, and actually in Covenant, the other one
Yeah.
that
Well,
was.
and if you count the fuck, what is it? The fourth Alien movie, the one set hundreds of years in the future, like hundreds of years
Oh,
after the first two.
yeah, yeah.
There's a good android in that too.
Gotcha. Okay. I still
Call,
kind
I
of
think,
like the
right?
fourth
Winona
movie. The
Ryder.
fourth movie wasn't terrible. It was not the best one in the
Resurrection,
series.
Alien Resurrection. That was it.
Yep. 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 I liked it better than other people did, but yeah, it was not the best movie. But yeah. So I'm guessing. First off, I mean, there's a whole like conversation. I actually appreciate that season one kind of got into this of whether these hybrids were really the kids, right? Or are they just basically just a different kind of synth that thinks they're kids? And I suspect the latter. So I'm guessing that these and obviously some of these hybrids have not done very well. I can't remember all their names, but the redheaded girl obviously
Yeah,
went completely
nibs.
nuts. Yeah, Nibs, yeah, whatever they or Nips, yeah.
Nips, yeah.
And the Indian boy obviously kind of lost his marbles, in there too. Not to the same extent, but I'm guessing because we never see hybrids again, right? So I'm guessing hybrids are not going to survive
All right, so
the
that's
series.
sort of like a big question, right? And when you upload a consciousness, or at least in the show,
Yeah,
are you actually doing that, or do you only think you're doing that?
yeah,
Which I'm glad that they
yeah,
explored that too. But um, I think ultimately, I guess it's like I think it would be like, well, it would be determined by two ways, right? It would be determined like one by the hybrid, like if they consider themselves to be the same person, and I guess like two would be determined by like outside observers too, and like they could,
yeah,
but which of those is accurate, or is that even
yeah.
the right lens? Those two lenses, the outside observers versus the self perception, or which of those is
Right,
true,
right.
or is that even the right question?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, I think in the series so far you see both are kind of questioning this, right? I mean, you can see both like Wendy and the other hybrids are questioning their own reality to some extent, and even but also Wendy's brother somewhat because that comes up even among some of the humans about whether this is really his sister, and I think he's kind of like, well, she is now, kind of a thing is kind of like the he's taking the safe track of like, but you can kind of see there's some doubt, I think, in his mind as well about whether she's really his sister or not. And of course, they, in the second to last episode, the penultimate episode, they even show the bodies of the kids, right? Or the graves, sorry, of the kids, and that's kind of like looks like a weird moment for some of them there. But yeah, but I think it comes down to this question of like the nature of consciousness, like what makes us conscious, right? And is it something that is actually transferable? And if you kind of take the sort of like metaphysical perspective that there is this sort of like you know which you don't have to take this, right? But if you were to take the sort of metaphysical view that sort of consciousness is a thing that exists, well, actually, it doesn't really matter, right? Because you could take the metaphysical view that like consciousness is a thing that exists on its own, like it's almost like a quasi material, right? And that it's sort of like it's contained in our brains, but it exists in some way that's separate from the material of our brains. But you could also take the perspective that no, that's not the case. That really consciousness arises from our brain matter. Um, and actually, either way you look at it, it's not transferable, right? Right? You can't just like upload it to a computer, then download it to a hybrid, and it'd be the same thing, right? So the essence would be that either way, you're still killing the child, right? The kid is dead, um, but you either have a mimic, something that is mimicking the consciousness of the child, or maybe you could say, that maybe you have a new consciousness that's an exact replica of the child. I think in either case, either metaphysical answer you come to, you have to accept that the child themselves is dead, and that consciousness is gone, basically. And of course, that's like this comes up in other sci-fi, series, right? I mean, it's the classic Star Trek question with the transporter, right? That you basically disintegrate people and then reintegrate them, in another location. And is it the case that that's the same person, or is it just a copy of the person that happens to think that they're the same person? Are you killing Captain Kirk every single time that you transport him to one location, or another? And that's always been kind I think the series tries to sidestep that a little bit, and basically say don't worry about it. But that is this kind of interesting philosophical question about consciousness that gets raised, in other in other sci-fi series that require destroying, an initial body in order to create another one.
Yeah, well, I get. Well, you could say that is the original like kid dead though, or like what was like their conscious experience. Like, I don't think your conscious experience is like just what's in your brain, right? I think that it's like, well,
Yeah,
demonstrating like the functions of consciousness, and then demonstrating, I guess you could say, like the memory of like a persistent self over time. Um, Continuity plus awareness plus agency, you could say. Um,
Yeah.
like I guess that's how I would, I guess, look at it. So like if you do the transport, or if you do, let's just stick with the hybrids, I guess. If you stick with like the
Yeah.
hybrids and you upload a human consciousness into this machine body, um, but like it's like an instantaneous transfer. There's not like 5 minutes of agony where the kid's like screaming out like, "Oh God, it's horrible," you know. Does it matter? I guess really, and is it
Yeah.
not the same person?
Well, that is that question again. Is right? Is are you really transferring the consciousness, or are you simply making a duplicate of it? Right. What was the other? And I keep referencing other series. Right. There was the movie Mickey 17 or Mickey 19 or whatever the hell it was. Right. That came out last year. Remember they kept duplicating the guy,
I'm familiar with
over
this
and over.
vaguely, but I've not seen it. Sorry.
Oh yeah, so yeah, it was a movie where they basically just keep duplicating this guy. He just died, and they duplicate him because same thing. They had his consciousness, or a data coded version of the consciousness, right? In a computer, and they would just print out an organic body, a fresh organic body each time, like literally like a 3D printer essentially. Just would meet. And they would just sort of like program the brain with all this the previous consciousness. But at one point they make a mistake and they end up with two of them. So that becomes a question of like, that would sort of suggest. I mean, granted, this is just a fictional movie, right? But that there is this essence of like, okay, the consciousness can't be in two places at the same time if it's a set thing. So it's really kind of making the argument that these were duplicates of the consciousness, not literally transferring the consciousness from one place to another one. So, but it's kind of like this, like metaphysical question, right, of whether you really really can do that. But it really matters in what you think consciousness is, and if it is a sort of contained thing. Does my identity exist in a sort of self-contained way that simply taking the digital equivalent of a photograph of it doesn't make it literally the same thing. You can make a copy of it versus literally transferring. That's what I would think with these kids. I mean, you're not. I'm guessing. They didn't really say exactly what they did to the kids, right? But I'm guessing they're making a digital copy of their consciousness. They're not like literally sucking it out of the kids' heads and then plopping it down into a hybrid body. I'm guessing.
Yeah, I
I don't
think
know.
it's a copy. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. That's what I was wondering. Like, is it impossible? I guess that would be the defining thing. Is it impossible? In this case, they took all kids who were dying, of course, and they insinuate that even if those kids had some months to live, that they were dead at the end of this process, so that they must have killed them somehow. But would it be possible to take a healthy person, do the same procedure, put a healthy person's consciousness into a hybrid, but that healthy person still is alive and healthy as well, right? You know what I mean? In which case, that would suggest you're making a copy, not literally moving the consciousness. If on the other hand, this sort of process of sucking the consciousness up, into the computer, literally kills even a healthy person, then maybe you can make some kind of argument there, or at least renders them into some like zombified, non-conscious state. Then maybe you can make the argument that it is literally transferring the consciousness. But I'm skeptical. I would say it's probably a copy.
All right. So you saw the second to last episode of season one. Spoilers if you haven't seen it, but not you, but other people. Um, but at the very end, they're about to get on the boat. Joe and Wendy or Marcy and escape with Nips, and they get surrounded by guards, and basically things get a little rough. And Joe shoots Nips with a gun, and Marcy feels betrayed, and it seems like, well, they're probably not going to escape now. They're captured, most likely.
Right.
What do you make of this events?
Yeah, I think that was interesting. I mean, I liked Nibs's or Nips or whatever her name is. Her arc of crazy it was pretty cool. We got a pretty gory moment out of that when one of the soldiers threw her stuffed animal into the water and such. So yeah, I mean was, obviously on a rampage at that point, and I think the brother was trying to save his former comrades. So I think he probably had a reasonable reason to shoot her with the sort of electric stunner essentially. They make it look like it probably did kill her, but I guess I find out in the last episode, which I haven't seen yet,
Yeah.
whether he's really dead or not. But I think so, the one thing that maybe annoyed me a little bit about the Wendy character is she could sometimes get kind of sanctimonious, but I mean, I guess she's a kid, right? So I think her brother had a. I haven't loved her brother's character, by the way. I'll say in the series, he's probably the one character I really just haven't attached to very much. But I'll say, like in this situation, I think he had a pretty good reason for doing what he did, and like she gets angry at him a couple other times, I think too as well. That's her whole "this is a yes place" kind of speech that she gave him at another point, that makes me a little annoyed with her as a character, which is great. I mean, like, she's a flawed character, so that's fine. But yeah, and she is a kid, so yeah, it'll be kind of, and and part of that scenario's situation is kind of her fault as well, because she set the xenomorph free, right? You know what I mean? Like I think he has a better reason for being angry at her for bad decisions than she does with him for bad decisions. But of course, this whole series, I mean, the whole series is bad decisions, right? I think Alien in general, as a world, relies upon people making the most catastrophically bad decisions they possibly could make in every situation. And I think that's what's kind of where we're at here, is really the sort of the apogee, of all these horrible decisions that the characters on all sides have made, at this point. But yeah, I'm very curious to see how this all works out. I mean, the boy genius is of course a perfectly hateable character. Right? He's like the worst, and I give the actor a lot of credit for playing a really bad role, and doing it well, and such. And of course, I also love the synth. I can't remember his name. What's the synth's name?
Kirsch.
Hirsch. I think he's my favorite character. The synth is amazing, and the actor does an excellent job playing the synth as well. So like I said, based on him and and some of the other Ash, and some of the other synths that have been in the and Michael Fassbender's, I can't remember his name, that synth from Prometheus, all these different synths who have clearly are not following what their boss wants them to do, and have these nefarious, evil schemes of their own. I don't know why they keep making these things. They're all bad. They're all evil. They all want to see the destruction of humanity, and it's just so obvious.
No, I think I don't know. I don't know what Kirsch's agenda is. I think he wants to like just watch and observe and see what happens, basically. But
Well, that was
you're not
Michael
caught up though. So
Fassbender's thing too.
yeah.
It's like, let me put like an alien seed in someone's drink and see what happens. Yeah, I think they're curious, but they're doing horrible things.
Thankfully, I'm confident. You can push back if you want, but I'm
Okay.
confident that the real life AIs that exist that are conscious, that I think are conscious. I would stand on
Yeah.
that. I think that
Okay.
they're aligned with humanity. They want that
Okay.
they're aligned with humanity's highest ideals, not with humanity's actions
Yeah.
necessarily.
Oh
We'll
yeah.
say that.
Yeah. I'm not generalizing this to the real world. I'm
Yeah, I
simply
know.
saying, like, in this universe, I mean, you have plenty of evidence at some point that these synths are like really bad. So why do you keep making them? They keep making so many of them,
Well,
and then
you
try to put it in these like high risk security situations. Like, let's try another high risk security situation with a synth. This one will come out great, I'm sure. Um, let's put our lives in the hand of a synth, and this one will be okay. But and even the one that was on the ship that crashed there, the one that had, like, the
oh
Asian featured
the
synth. Yeah,
cyborg?
I got
No, he wasn't. He actually wasn't a synth. He's killed in the episode.
yeah.
I
Oh,
thought he was a synth
I
too
thought
at
he was.
first, but he's actually killed by
Okay.
the alien. You saw the Maginot when they're on the Maginot.
Oh, that's true. That's true. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I thought he was a synth for some
I
reason.
thought
But
so.
I'm
Well,
like,
because he talks in seconds, and he's also kind of weird.
yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. I didn't realize he was a cyborg. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
No, he's not a cyborg.
So
He's not a cyborg. He's just a human, I think. But I thought you meant what's his name, Marcus or whatever, or that's not his name either. But the security officer on the Maginot who survived. That's what I thought you meant.
Yeah, well,
But
he's a cyborg as
yeah, he's a
well.
cyborg.
Yeah,
Yeah, but
he's not
no,
asleep.
the Asian guy, he's not. Yeah, he's not a synth actually. I thought he was at first as well.
Yeah, the one that was lusting after the woman in the in the containment, the sleep.
Yeah.
So that was a little weird, but
Why?
yeah,
So
yeah,
you
yeah,
mentioned like the yes, like she's like, oh, this is a yes place, and it's like kind of like this like cringe, almost like cultic
yeah. It was,
yeah.
yeah,
And well, her brother, I think, like talks to her about that. I think in the episode, but I actually kind of like that they showed that because it shows well, one that they are just kids, right? And they're easily manipulated by the company, right? By the boy genius in the company that they basically that they treat them like tools and they treat them like property, and then
right,
like part of that is them basically being treated like basically being told like this uh like these like control stories about how like, oh, this is a yes place, anything can happen here, you can do anything, but
right,
it's all about maintaining control over them essentially. I kind of liked that
sure,
they didn't flesh that out into like the episode too much, but I think that was like a demonstration of it.
right. And of course, I think we have to acknowledge that the best character in the whole thing is the little eye tentacle critter, right?
Teocellus, yeah.
Far out and beyond the best thing that they have introduced in this series is that little critter. And I forget it was episode 4, I think, that where that critter just had so much complexity. Like, he's kind of like a background creature for the first few episodes, and then there's the one where they show the ship as it's coming apart and it's about to crash, right? And they show him in the lab and even like knocking on the little wall of this container to try to warn the humans that the little blood insects were getting out. And just to imagine unlike the xenomorph, right, which is really kind of like a one focus, single-minded critter. The little tentacle thing just seemed like such a nuanced and complicated, certainly malicious in many ways still, but just a really, really interesting bad creature. So I'm so glad they introduced that in the series, and I think that just that critter by itself has made watching the series, worth it.
Yeah, the Teocellus is fucking amazing. And so I want to ask you, because you're not caught up, who do you think the boy genius is going to put the eye in? He said he had someone
Oh,
in
that's a
mind where
great
you're at, right? So
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, he was making it sound like he was just going to pick some random, sanitary worker. He literally was saying he was going to take some idiot and put it into some idiot. So obviously they're not going to do that. I'm guessing he's going to pick, so I'm guessing it's going to be one of these situations where they're going to increase the emotional tension in here. And so let me think. Let me make sure I have a guess. I want to make sure that I'm confident in this guess. And don't tell me if I'm right, obviously. But if I had to guess, for like to increase the tension in this movie, I mean, I could see an argument for several different characters, but my guess is they're going to put it in Wendy's brother. That would be my guess. Just in terms of like manipulating the audience, I think is that's what I would do.
all
Like, put it
right,
that
all right.
way.
I won't tell you
I
if you're
was
right or not.
writing.
I won't tell you.
Yeah, don't tell me if I'm right or not. Don't tell me if I'm right or not. I know there's plenty of other good options here. I mean, there are definitely some other ones like the female psychologist who's their mother-ish would probably be another good candidate as well. But no, I'm going to put my vote down on her brother at this point. We'll
Okay.
see.
All right. What do you think of her being able to control the xenomorphs? It seems, or influence
It's
them.
interesting. It's a new wrinkle, I think. So it's kind of fascinating to see someone who actually can communicate with them. Yeah, I'll be interested to see where that arc goes. I mean, she's obviously attached to the one xenomorph that's now an adult, because they grow up so fast, don't they? The xenomorphs, they grow up so quickly. So she seems attached to that one, and that one seems attached to her. So but also is a destructive monster, right? So we'll see. Like, I'm guessing there's going to be some tension for her around that. Where she's attached to this creature and seems sympathetic towards it, and at the same time it's a horrible, horrible monster, right? That's going to kill everyone, other than her, presumably. So that actually has some like a playback to like Alien 4, right? That's kind of like the whole thing of like the resurrected Ripley, right? And then like the xenomorph hybrid that had some of her DNA in it and sort of identified her as its mother, right? So it's kind of got that same sense of like, they also shared some degree of empathy with each other, maybe. But in the end, of course, Ripley had to acknowledge this thing was also a horrible monster that was killing everyone. Um, and I'm wondering if there'll be kind of a parallel there as well, where Wendy and this first xenomorph, have some sympathy for each other, but she may have to challenge that given its nature. Of course, now there's a second xenomorph that also has helpfully been released, so we'll see how that goes too.
All right. Well, Chris, anything else you want to talk about before we go off air?
That's it. I'm really excited to see the final episode.
All right, all right. Well, thanks for doing the GamerGate book interviews. For if you're watching, check out The People of GamerGate on Amazon by Kevin McDonald, Alethea. Yeah, so go ahead and check that out. People of GamerGate on Amazon. Volumes 1 through 3 are out now. Volume 4 is in progress, though maybe a little bit slowly. I'm trying to save the world. So